Hey, I hope everybody had a good time in Chavruta. I got to go into some of the rooms and hear some interesting ideas that people came up with. We're now going to go through the sources, and as we go through, we're going to get to some of the issues that you grappled with in the Chavruta. And if there's parts, as I said, that you didn't get to, not to worry. We'll get to everything and cover it in class. And you can always, I like to always say, is you can always go back after class and go through the sources. There's value to doing Chavruta after you've seen them already inside. One thing while you were in class, I remember what I wanted to say about the Eruv. In Eruv, there's a big debate, and it's something that permeates, I would say penetrates, or it comes up many times throughout the Masechet, is do we view an Eruv as a mechitza, as a wall, kind of blocking it in as if we're in some closed off area? Or is it a heker? Is it a noticeable something, right? We put up what's called a lechi or a korah. We put up a beam going vertical or going horizontal, or we call it surat hapetah, to make you remember, like to make you think about, oh, wait, outside there is the public domain. And all of the sugiyot address this issue in some way or other, and they side on one side or the other. And it's something that we see a lot in our sugya as well, which is every sugya we're going to see seems to always go back to this idea, is this a punishment or is this for protection purposes? And like I said, in some of them we'll get to the atonement as well. And it's something very interesting to see, and it's something that comes up in Gemara a lot, because Gemara is not a one-dimensional book. It's something that always has a lot of dimensions going on. And when someone says something, it's usually much deeper than just the words they use. And that's what learning it in depth gives you the ability to really think about these concepts and what's going on. So with that, we'll get started with our Mishnah. Okay, our Mishnah starts off with Lehechan golin la'arei miklah. Where do you go to your miklah? Where are they? L'shalosh shebe'ever hayarden, u'l'shalosh shebe'eretz Canaan, shene'emar. Et shalosh ha'arim titnu me'ever le'yarden, et shalosh ha'arim titnu be'eretz Canaan. So the pasuk says, when you're in a Mishnah and it says shene'emar, it means you're going to have a pasuk. Okay, when you're in the Gemara and it says dichtiv, it means you're going to have a pasuk. Each one uses a different language. We're going to see dichtiv today, and we see shene'emar. And by the way, I want to show you a trick, which is if you're in the Gemara itself, let's see if I can zoom in a little. I don't know what just happened there. Oh. Okay, here we go. Now, if you look at the Mishnah here, you see that all throughout the Mishnah, there's these little numbers. There's a 4 there. Then there's a 5. There's a 6. Those are all indicators that there are verses in the Torah and they're quoted. Okay, and it also says shene'emar, but it doesn't always use the word shene'emar. So if you're using the actual text of the Gemara, it gives you that indicator that's what's going on. So let's go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah tells us that there's 3 on the east bank of the Jordan River, and there's 3 in Israel. Okay, we have 3 there, 3 there. Now, what was the east bank? That was where the people in Shevet Gad, Reuven, and Chatzi Shevet Menashe. So we have 2.5 tribes on one side. We have 9.5 tribes on the other. This is going to lead us much later to a big question. Why do we have 3 on this side and 3 on this side when we have a much larger number of people living on one side and much fewer people living on the other, and yet we have the exact same number of cities? So the pasuk says, okay, and the reason is going to be very clear. The Torah says so, right? The question is, why did the Torah set this up? And we're going to get to that later. So 3 on one side, 3 on the other side. Ad shelo nivcharu shalosh be'eretz Yisrael lo hayu shalosh be'ever hayarden kol tov. But they didn't actually start operating. They weren't operational until they conquered the land. And if you read Rashi already, Rashi says not only, right, it's the 7 years of conquering and then the 7 years where they divided the land. Shene'emar shesh arei miklat tiyena, because it says there's 6, there will be 6. Ad shiu shesh tam, they darshan that pasuk, until you have all 6. Kol tov ke'echad. They all have to be operational. Until then, they don't function at all. Now, I asked you this question in the Chavruta. What does that seem to you like this is part of? Is it more for protection or is it more for punishment? And this definitely seems to be siding on the punishment. Why? Because if you needed protection, what should it matter? If already people are living on the east bank of the Jordan River and they need to be protected from the relatives that might kill them, of course you would need the city to be operational. So what's the reason to wait till after the 14 years? Well, there's all sorts of things that can't happen until those 14 years are over. It's more like a system. In order for the system to work, you have to get past the whole conquering and settling. Once you're settled, you can appoint a king. That's one of the things you have to wait for. You can't build the temple yet. And this is another one of them. This is part of the court system. The Ir Miklat, according to this Mishnah, seems to be as part of the court system. And the court system isn't operational until everything is set up. Once everything's set up, we can start. The court can have jurisdiction, but there's really no jurisdiction until everything is done. And that's why this source seems to be more pointing out the punishment aspect, where the court is kind of, they're operating more as a court rather and administering punishment rather than offering protection, because protection should happen as soon as the city exists. Now the Mishnah continues and said, well, you have to make signs. You should get the path ready and kind of split it into 3 sections, which is really 4 sections. Okay, we put them in 3s, we'll get to there. Now we get to this interesting part. As I said in the Chavruta when I came into some of the rooms, I said, wouldn't you think that if you want this person now, imagine the scene. You accidentally murder someone, you're running to the Ir Miklat. Now, who comes with you? Well, first of all, you have the redeeming relatives who are basically chasing you, and they want to kill you. And really what you need is bodyguards. But instead of getting bodyguards, you get 2 Torah scholars. Torah scholars are usually not the strongest people. They're not exactly going to protect you so much, or at least from a physical perspective. So the question is, what is the job of these Talmidei Chachamim? And the Mishnah tells us, Shema Yehargenu Baderech. They're worried that the relatives might kill you on the way, and therefore, Vayidabru Elav. They speak to him. And now, according to Tanakama, that's the first Tana who we just heard. How do I know it's called Tana? Why is it Tanakama? Because in a minute, we're going to have Rabbi Meir say something different. So this is where you see there's already a debate. So what does Tanakama say? It says, who's supposed to speak? The Torah scholars, that's their job. Why do you bring Torah scholars? Because they're knowledgeable. They can speak. They might not be able to protect you physically, but they can speak and offer their advice. What exactly they're supposed to speak, we're going to get to when we get to the commentaries. Rabbi Meir Omer, and here comes something that I wrote in the sheet. Hopefully you all read it, but if not, I'll explain it right now. In the Gemara, and this, I didn't say all of this, which is sometimes you see rounded parentheses, sometimes you see square brackets. Square brackets means whoever edited this thought that this word should be in there, but it didn't appear in the text he had in front of him. So he didn't want to change it. Okay, there's a certain sanctity to the page while also saying there's not sanctity to the page, because you're saying there's a mistake, but I'm not convinced it's a mistake, but I think it's a mistake. And I'm telling you, this is how you should read it. So if you see rounded parentheses, it means this word was in the text, and whoever put this in, the printer, who sent it to be printed, thought it shouldn't be there. And therefore put parentheses around, which means don't read this. But obviously someone did have that text. And therefore, what we're going to show you is that some people read it one way and some people read it the other way. And it's a very small word, but it has a lot of significance. If you say without the word af, Rabbi Meir says, Hu medaber le'yedei atzmo. He speaks for himself. Who has to be the one to speak? And here we see it in the text, Shnema, v'zeh davar harotzeach. Davar means the speech, from dibur, to speak. This is what the murderer says. So he has to speak for himself, and he has to basically, again, what he says, we're going to see a bunch of different interpretations, but he has to say either I made a mistake, or it was an accident, or I'm sorry, or something like that. But if you say, and so again, then we have the rabbis say the Talmidei Chachamim speaks, and Rabbi Meir says, no, the murderer speaks. But if you say Afu Medaber, then it means even he could speak, which means he could speak, or the Talmidei Chachamim can speak. Okay, so now I'm going to skip down for a minute, and we'll get back to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina shortly. And we're going to see, so here we talked about the 14 years. Okay, what I did here, I'll already tell you, is I filled in all the answers as I did last week. So this will be posted up on the site, and you can go back and review this with all the answers in it. As well, there's also a quiz. I was pleased to see that a lot of people took the quiz last week. So please use the quiz. It's a good way to quiz yourself how you're doing. It helps you because since we're not getting grades or anything, it's good to review and be able to see how much you gained from the course. So now, again, we saw that it was the 14 years, and then Rashi says here, Vayidabru elav. So now this was in the rabbi's opinion that the Talmidei Chachamim speak. Now, who do they speak to? Now, someone suggested, which I thought was an excellent suggestion, was that maybe, and this is not what we see in the commentaries that I brought, but this is why I like you to think before you read the commentaries, because even if the commentary didn't say it, first of all, maybe I didn't bring all the commentaries that there are, maybe someone does say it, or sometimes you could also have your own opinion, which might also be another opinion. So one of the suggestions made was that maybe the Talmidei Chachamim come to be type of a social worker. And we talked last week about the struggles of this person who just murdered someone. And if they have two Talmidei Chachamim with them, they can be a kind of spiritual guide for this person to kind of help them work through their struggles with the fact that they just murdered someone. But Rashi says here, Vayidabru elav, what's their role? They speak to who? To the Goel Adam. V'omrim lo, al tinhag bo minhag shofchei damim, their job is to point out, number one, it was an accident. And because it's an accident, now we all of a sudden understand why they're Torah scholars who come to do. They tell them the halacha, right? The law is you're not allowed to kill and don't murder him because, we're the rabbis, we're telling you, you shouldn't murder this person because it was really just an accident. So that's what Rashi tells us here. Now, what we see, I'm going to go now into the Tiferet Yisrael, and he brings two commentaries. The first thing I want to point out is structural, again, because part of what I'm teaching you here is how to read texts. And whether you read it in English or you read it in Hebrew, the important part is to understand where we're getting to a second opinion. Well, there's key words here that are very small words, like that little word af, which makes all the difference. Likewise here, sometimes it's the very little words or the minor things that help you understand how to read it or what the meaning is. So this word in the middle, ve'efshal, and it is, and perhaps, or it is possible. Okay, so that already means it's possible. That means, oh, well, here's a second suggestion. That's your key word that's going to tell you we're up to suggestion number 2. So here we have two options. The first one, the Tiferet Yisrael, is a very famous commentary on the Mishnah. And he says, Ein tzarich tamid chacham. You don't need the Talmid Chacham. In his first interpretation, he's going with either or. You don't need him, but he could. Shebe'atzmo yuchal lehitnatzel. That means if he wants to, he could apologize himself. Ve'eino nir'eh kemaktin chat'o. He's not looking like he's belittling what a terrible thing he did. He's admitting it. If he says it himself, it's not belittling. Okay, why would it be belittling? Why is he even suggesting maybe it would be belittling? And actually, because the rabbis think it is. Because the rabbis think better someone else do the speaking. Because these relatives, again, you have to just imagine the scene. Without imagining it, it's hard to, you can totally imagine that what's going on here. You have the guy just murdered someone. The relatives are super angry. And imagine you're the murderer and you get up and say, I'm sorry, it was just an accident. And the relatives look at you like, what are you, crazy? What do you mean it was just an accident? You just murdered my brother, my father. And all they want is to get into a fight with you. So the rabbis are saying, better off have somebody else do this for you. It's going to be much more effective. And Rabbi Meir says, no, it's important for him to apologize. And here, again, I'm not convinced by it. Here, some of the places I think it's more convincing, some of them less. But it's very possible that what they're showing here is you have to admit to your sin. Rabbi Meir views this as you have to get up and say, I did something wrong. This is part of the punishment process. And here you're not even yet in the Ir Miklat, in the refuge city, and you already have to be apologizing and stand up and say, I made a mistake. And therefore, it's important to Rabbi Meir specifically that you get up there and you apologize. But the second option is the other, which is Efshar de Rabbi Meir tzarich hu lefayes goel adam lomar shagiti. So here in the first option, by the way, yeah, I forgot to mention this. In the first option, the reading is even, meaning you might have thought he's belittling it, and he'll, right? But no, you could be the one to apologize. It could be either way. Because you see that, because it says, Ein tzarich tamid chacham. You have to be when you read text, you have to be very careful reader. Ein tzarich tamid chacham means you don't need, but it doesn't mean they can't do it, right? It means either one can do it. And it's just, you might have thought he's not going to be taken seriously. Well, Rabbi Meir thinks he will be. But in the second reading, Rabbi Meir tzarich hu lapayes goel hadam. He has to do it, possibly. This is the second possibility. Only the murderer. This is without the word af. He's supposed to speak. Lomar shagiti. He has to get up and say, I made a mistake. Now, what's the point here? Not because it's part of the atonement, punishment process, but no. Modeh sheshochim imo shtayim shefaisuhu gamhem. Maybe it's because, okay, what he points out here is, really, we need the guy to be protected. And the question is, who's going to be the most effective speaker? Is it better so that the relatives don't murder you? Is it better that you speak yourself? And according to the second interpretation, yes. You have to say, you have to take responsibility. You have to say, I made a mistake. And that will be what will protect you, basically, from getting attacked by these relatives. And then he just points out a funny thing, which is kind of what I was saying, which is, well, why didn't they send big, strong men? Instead, they sent these, weak Talmidei Chachamim. So he says, this is a really interesting, and I think it's something we can relate to in our daily life, or I don't know, daily life, but it does come up. It's a fascinating line. I had this one situation once where I had a contractor and I had a bit of an issue with him, and he didn't do what he was supposed to do. And I brought a very big hotshot lawyer, and it was a huge mistake because he brought a bigger hotshot lawyer, and basically I was doomed at that point. And this is what they're saying. It's exactly that. It's that if you bring strong people to protect you, he'll see you bringing strong people, and the relatives will possibly bring even stronger people, and you'll end up with a big showdown, which is what you want to avoid. So he gives a fascinating explanation as to why you bring the rabbis. So I want to just kind of take all these things that we've seen and summarize and give us a few different thoughts we've had about what the purpose of this walk and what's happening or this run. You imagine this marathon, everybody's kind of running to get to this Ir Miklat, some trying to get there and some trying to get them before they get there, and what exactly is happening. So one idea is that we want you to basically be taking responsibility for what you did. And you really did something wrong. You killed someone accidentally. You weren't being careful enough, because otherwise you wouldn't have to go to Ir Miklat. We've already established that last week. And you have to take responsibility. And once you're in the Ir Miklat, you're not going to be doing that because you're not going to have anything to do with these people. This is your last moment to actually have something to do with them. And you have to basically stand up and say, I made a mistake, at least according to those who say you have to, right? The other option is to say that we're really just trying to prevent, the fact is, you don't necessarily live right next door to the refuge city, and you've got to get there. And we know that once you get there, it's like a giant game of tag, right? Once you get on base, you're safe, but we've got to get you to base, which is not an easy thing. And for that, we need to bring along these Talmidei Chachamim, possibly. Again, their job is to appease, to calm down the other side, calm down the relatives, to give them the halachics about it, that, if you kill him, you're going to get murdered, you're going to get the death penalty. And their job is to kind of be there, maybe, as we said, possibly a social worker also. And they play this role. Obviously, if we're the rabbis, they play a stronger role. If you're Rabbi Meir, they play a less of a role, but they still have a supporting role. Okay, and their job is to basically to help you. Again, whether we view this as punishment, then their job is to, is to maybe help you to take responsibility for what you did wrong, and to help you to basically go through that process. If it's to protect, right, then their job is to convince the relatives that you really aren't such a bad guy and you didn't really mean to do what happened, and it wasn't really your fault. Okay, now we're moving on to the Gemara. The Gemara here is made up of a Braita, Tanu Rabanan, like we saw last week, which is an introduction to a Braita. Now here, the punctuation was a little bit tricky, and I want to show you some tricks about how you would know how to punctuate. So we said normally when you switch from Hebrew to Aramaic, that's your signal that the Braita ends and the next section starts. But here we ended up with some Hebrew in the beginning of the sentence after. I already highlighted where the Braita is. So let's read through the Braita and then I'll show you how, again, this was not something I expected you to necessarily be able to figure out, but I will tell you how I figured out how to punctuate here and what the trick is to be able to help you for next time. So Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis learned, Shalosh Arim Hivdil Moshe be'Ever HaYarden. He separated 3 in Ever HaYarden, Ukinegdam Hivdil Yoshua be'Eretz Canaan. This is very similar to our Mishnah. Umechubanot hayu kamin shtei shurot bekerem. Now, if it's very similar to the Mishnah, why are they telling you this? Because they're adding details that you didn't know before. We're now going to see where the cities were, which ones were opposite which ones. They were like 2 rows in a vineyard, which are very neat and organized. We'll see the map in a minute. Hebron b'Yehuda kineged Betzer b'Midbar. So Hebron in Judea, and then there was Betzer in the desert. There was Shechem and Har Ephraim, Ramot b'Gilad on the other side of the Jordan. Kedesh b'Har Naphtali kineged Golan b'Bashan. So you basically end up, I can even jump for a minute to the map. You can see all this very nicely on the map. You see these are the 3 cities. They're each opposite the other 3. It's not exactly as clean and exactly organized the way we did it in the map here, but on the real map, they're a little bit off, but they're close enough that we can say it's very organized. Now it says Vishilashta. What does it mean? We saw that word in the Mishnah, and now we're going to understand. Shilashta means from the word of 3, shalosh. Shehu mishulashim. What does it mean, you mishulashim? Shehe midarom lechevron, kemi chevron l'shchem, u'michevron l'shchem, kemi shchem l'kadesh, u'mishchem l'kadesh, kemi kedesh l'tzvon. Basically, we're going to split it into, 3. Okay, it's really 4 because you're going to have from the north to Kadesh, from Kadesh to Shechem, from Shechem to Hebron, right? You're going to have, and then from 1, 2, 3, and then 4 from Hebron to the southern border. Okay, so that's what they understand from Vishilashta means you're going to put these 3 at equal intervals from each other, but they're actually going to be separated from the border. So you're going to end up with 4 sections. Okay, so again, 1 at the top, 1 from Kadesh to Shechem, 1 from Shechem to Hebron, and 1 from Hebron all the way to the south. Then now we're done with the Braita. How do we know the Braita ends here? Because the first Aramaic word you get is tlat. In Hebrew and Aramaic, taf in Aramaic is like shin in Hebrew. So tlat is shalosh. That's how you remember it. If you read, and let's say you thought maybe Be'ever HaYarden had to do with the other. So there's 2 ways you know that Be'ever HaYarden is a new thing. Because first of all, it was talking about the places from Shechem to Kadesh and to Kadesh to the north. And then you're kind of at the end of a sentence. Be'ever HaYarden wouldn't really make sense as being at the end of that sentence. That's number 1. Now, often when things repeat, you realize that they repeat for a reason. So here it says Be'ever HaYarden tlat and Be'eretz Yisrael tlat. So now you see, because of the tlat, the shalosh appears after Ever HaYarden, and the shalosh appears after Eretz Yisrael. And that would be your trick to realizing that's one thing. And then how do you know something new starts? Because then you have Amar Abaye. Abaye said. So then you're going to have already, that's usually your indicator. If Abaye is saying something, he's already explaining something, probably the line before that was a question. Often when you end a Braita, they'll often ask a question on the Braita, and then they'll answer it. Again, these are things with experience, you'll get better at figuring out how to do this. So now the question is, and the other trick, by the way, was Rashi. Rashi tells you, Be'ever HaYarden tlat, bitmia. Rashi often does this, and it's actually, if you didn't really catch the question, it's good, because Rashi didn't expect you to catch the question either. And that's why Rashi helps you and tells you this is a question, just so you know. Okay, and he doesn't usually do that. He only does it when it's tricky and it's harder to figure it out. So he says, bitmia. What's the question now? Here comes our big question, which is going to basically take us for most of the rest of class. B'nachalat shnei shvatim shalosh, kemo b'nachalat asara shvatim? How could you possibly have 3 on this side and 3 on that side? The way they set it up in the Braita is very even. This has 3, this has 3, perfect, okay. In the map, it looks really nice. But he says there's something that makes absolutely no sense, the Gemara asks. There's so many more people living. There's 10 tribes over there, and there's only 2.5, right? It's really 9.5, and 2.5 tribes there. So why? Why would you have the same amount of cities? And here comes our big answer, which is really a problematic answer. Amar Abaye, Bigilad. Okay, Gilad, remember there was Ramot Bigilad, that was on the east side of the Jordan. Bigilad shchichei rotzchim, there's a lot more murderers there. Dichtiv, Gilad Kiryat Poalei Aven akuva midam. The Gemara wants to know, what is this word akuva midam? My akuva midam, Amar Rabbi Eliezer, shayu okuvim laharog nefashot. They would ambush people to kill them. Now, what's the purpose of an Ir Miklat? It's for accidental murders. So why did you need so many Arei Miklat on the east side of the Jordan? Because there's a lot of intentional murderers. Something doesn't jive there. Why, if there are intentional murderers, does that cause you to need more refuge cities for accidental murderers? And it's very hard to say that they're talking about accidental murderers because the language they're using is okvim laharog nefashot. They're ambushing people to murder people. So basically what they're going to say is that on the east side of the Jordan, there's more murderers. Because there are more murderers, there's more of a need for more refuge cities. Wow, that's a difficult question. That's a difficult answer. It doesn't really make so much sense. So the question is, why is that? So what I brought here is, and before we get to the answers, I want to read the last section of the Gemara because it's going to have the exact same structure. Okay, we started with Abaye's answer. He brought a pasuk using the word dichtiv, as I mentioned before, as opposed to shene'emar in the Mishnah. Dichtiv. Okay, by the way, in the Gemara, it's very obvious what they're quoting. Anything with the root katav, dichtiv, is katav, it was written in the written Torah. Tana, anything with the root tana, tanu rabanan, tanya, tanan, all those words are Tanaitic sources. And when it says amal, I know you think amar is it's just said, but amar is from the language of an emorah. So usually when it says what someone said, it's usually an emorah. I mean, you do have Tanaim speaking and saying amar, but often if you have the word like someone said, it's usually amirah. It has to do with an emorah. So the next sugya, it really asks the same type question and brings the same type answer. It's a different question, but it's going to bring the exact same answers we had before. Now they ask, Umayshna mehai gisa umehai gisa de merachke, Umayshna mitzia de mekarve. They point out something very interesting. If you go back to this map, it's not the most perfect map for this purpose, but remember we said it splits it up into 4 sections. There's the northern border, all to Kadesh. Then there's from Kadesh to Shechem, Shechem to Hebron, and Hebron to the south. And all those sections were even. So that means if you're at the northern border and you want to get to Kadesh, you have to cross a quarter of the country. And if you're in the southern border and you want to get to Hebron, you have to go a quarter of the way. But let's say you're in between Hebron and Shechem. How far are you going to have to go? 1/8 of the way, because you either are closer to Shechem or you're closer to Hebron. No matter what, you will not have to travel a distance more than 1/8 of the country. So that's what the Gemara is struggling with. They said this wasn't a smart way to divide them. If you wanted to divide it evenly, you should have divided it evenly in a way that everybody would only have to cover maximum, right, the same amount of space. But here, if you're living at the northern border or the southern border, you're going to have to go double the way to get to the Ir Miklat than everybody else. There could be other answers to this, like maybe less people were living on the periphery, right? Those are like out, and maybe there's just less people. But it's not what the Gemara answers. The Gemara is going to bring the same answer as we had before. So again, Maishna means what's the difference between this side, that's right, the northern border and the southern border, which are far away from the Arei Miklat. And why are the middle cities so close to the Arei Miklat? To which Abaye again is answering, same exact structure, and he's going to again quote a pasuk of Rabbi Elazar. In the center of the country, you have a lot more murderers. Dichtiv uchachei ish gedudim chever kohanim derech yirtzachu shchema, which basically means, okay, you can read this in the English, as troops of robbers wait for a man, so does the band of priests, they murder in the way towards Shechem. There's a bunch of things that are strange in this pasuk. First of all, there's all these murderers in Shechem. Okay, that seems to be saying that. What do the Kohanim have to do with this? My chever Kohanim, what does a chever Kohanim have anything to do with this? Amar Rabbi Elazar, שהיו מתחברים להרוג נפשות ככהנים הללו שמתחברים לחלוק תרומות בבית הגרנות. We had time, we try to think about this sentence and what the sentence means and why they're comparing it to Kohanim who get together to collect the truma, as opposed to the murderers who get together to murder people. Either which way, again, same structure, which is just interesting to see. The Gemara often does this. They bring things in the exact same structure, one after the other. A question was asked, why, right? Why are there more cities, more refuge cities here? Or why is there a shorter distance here? Because they need it more. Okay, why do they need it more? And here comes again the question that really makes the answer that makes no sense. Because there's more murderers. What does that have to do with this? Again, this also seems to be talking about intentional murderers. Now, what's interesting about this sugya and what we're not going to get to today is how do all the commentaries we're going to see, how do they explain this second Gemara? Because all of them comment on the first Gemara about the city in the area of Gilad, that there's more murderers there. Some of them might be relevant, some of them might not be as relevant to the second answer, but that's already beyond what we're going to do in this class. But right now, we're going to go through a number of commentaries who are all struggling with this question. Okay, they're all struggling with, okay, even if they don't say it, like Tosfot, for example, doesn't even bring his question, but they're all struggling with what do intentional murderers have to do with refuge cities. So Tosfot says, hey, this is what Abaye means. Ulahachi hutzrachnu arei miklat, lefi shehorgim mezid below edim, when people murder without witnesses, HaKadosh Baruch Hu mizamnan lepundak echad kedamrinan lekaman. Very famous Gemara Masechet Makkot. It's a pasuk that's a little hard to understand. It says, Asher lo tzada, someone who doesn't intend, v'Elohim imna liyado, and God orchestrates it. V'samti lecha makom asher yanu shama, I will give you a place to run away to. What does God have to do with this? Okay, and this is what Rish Lakish darshan. From evil people, bad things will come. What is it talking about? Two people who killed somebody. There's one who kills accidentally, but nobody saw, like a hit and run. There's one who kills on purpose, but there were no witnesses and warnings, and you won't get the death penalty unless there were witnesses who warned him and all that. And basically, God orchestrates it that what? They're both going to meet in the same place. The one who accidentally murdered before is going to accidentally murder again. And who's he going to accidentally murder? The one who's deserving of the death penalty. And that way, he says, right, the one who's been mezid is going to be sitting under a ladder, and the one who killed B'Shogeg is going to be coming down the ladder, and he's going to fall on top of the other one, and he's basically going to kill him. And that's how God orchestrates that what's supposed to happen, what the court has failed to do because it doesn't have the ability to do, God is going to make sure that happens. So now, let's try to fill in the blank. What does Tosfot basically say? When there's intention, he's basically saying that there must be both intentional murderers who never got punished because they weren't warned or anything, and there were probably also a lot of accidental murderers there, and therefore there's going to be all the more murders going on. Accidental murders are going to take place to basically punish the ones who were intentional and end up punishing, really. This seems to be saying, we want justice to be served here. And the one who was killed accidentally, who was the hit and run, and basically thought they could get away with it, is not going to get away with it anymore. So again, what do you see here? Number one, he translates murderers as both intentional and unintentional, and he connects the two. He says, yes, it's true that we're talking about intentional murderers, but it's all connected because those murderers need to be killed by those who killed accidentally. And then that's going to cause more murders to take place and therefore more need for refuge cities. Now, why this specifically happened in this city, and particularly on the east side, it's a good question, right? It's saying, this is right, when people say, oh, it's a bad neighborhood, and there's, right, this is basically what he's saying about that area. In the Meiri, he actually quotes Tosfot first, and he brings up Tosfot question, what Tosfot didn't say himself, but he says, you might say, Mama kom lemitziat rotzchim leklitat hariga b'shogeg. What's the connection? Oh, shema mitoch. And then after he suggests Tosfot, he brings up Tosfot, he says, I have another suggestion. Maybe mitoch sherotzchim mitzuyim, because there's a lot of murderers, there's a fascinating creative interpretation, yizdamnu legoel hadam harbe mehem, umesim lo orvim, umishum kach uvdilu sham shalosh arim. If there's more murderers, then what does that mean? If I accidentally kill in a place where there's a lot of murderers, the chances are that I killed someone who has relatives who are murderers, and they're going to go chase me. So I'm more likely going to get killed on the way to the refuge city. So you better set up more refuge cities per capita than in another place where that won't necessarily happen. This obviously is motivated by the Meiri's approach, which is the cities are for protection purposes and not necessarily for punishment. Because here, the whole issue has to do with protecting me who accidentally murdered someone. Okay, now moving on to the Ramban. The Ramban says, again, if you're going to say, right, only shogegim come, right? So what does he point out? Well, remember, we talked about in the beginning, the first class, that potentially everyone comes to the Ir Miklat, and then they judge them. Remember, the Psukim seem to say everybody goes, and then they kind of start sorting who's intentional, who's unintentional. So actually, if there's more intentional murderers, then you actually need the Ir Miklat. You need more place to at least take people in and do the initial intake, because there's a lot more people, and people are still looking for refuge, even if they don't necessarily belong there. So that's an interesting answer, because it would seem weird that we would have to establish something for people who are trying to go to the Ir Miklat when they don't really deserve to be there. But it is a way to at least connect between, right, connect the dots between intentional murder and Ir Miklat. Rabbeinu Yonatan, and again, it seems everyone's looking for protection there, both the intentional and the unintentional murderers. Rabbeinu Yonatan says, he comes up with the another creative interpretation. Oh, it was forest land there, and everybody went there to chop trees. And because they went there to chop trees, what happens when you chop trees, right? One of the main examples in the Torah of Ir Miklat is when you kill someone accidentally while you're chopping a tree, and a piece falls out of your axe and goes flying and kills somebody. So he actually says, forget the rotzchim, and obviously it's a little bit difficult because the psukim seem to be talking about intentional murders. He just says it's just a much more likely place that you're going to by accidental murders because of the lay of the land, because there's a lot of people who chop trees there. The last interpretation we're going to see is near Eli. And by the way, that one doesn't really side on either side of whether it's protection or punishment. So the Maharal says, he's the only one here who's not a Rishon. He's later, he said, near Eli, ki kol shogeg hayalo liot nishar shelo yahavog. V'lachen chayav galu. So he says again, as opposed to we saw before, oh, they just need protection. No, you're responsible, okay? Anyone who kills really obviously wasn't being careful enough, and therefore needs to go and get exiled. Right? And that's, again, as opposed to what we talked about last time, that maybe it's best for you emotionally to go to some place away from everything else. He says, no, why would we take you away from your community and all that if you really didn't do anything wrong? Clearly, it's punishment. But he says, right? You should have been more careful. What does this have to do with Gilad and having a lot of murderers? So he basically says, you have a lot of intentional murderers. And you won't even find, he says, what is he basically saying? Okay, I'm not going to read the whole thing inside. But what he's saying is, if you live in a place where there's intentional murderers, life becomes not as valuable as in other places, right? If you're surrounded by murderers, then it's going to ultimately affect people who unintentionally kill. Because if you're in a place where nobody really cares about people's lives and their neighbors' lives, then yeah, that's how accidents happen, because you're not so careful about it. If you're very careful and you really value human life, then that's not going to happen. So basically, he says that, again, we're going to end up with people who kill. Both murderers includes intentional, and not just, like Tosfot said, also unintentional because, God wants to orchestrate this, but more that when there's intentional murderers, there's automatically going to be unintentional murderers as well, because it's what the status quo is, it's what the vibe is in the place that you live, and that affected what it is. And really, he views them all. It's obvious that he views this whole refuge city as punishment, because he really blames the accidental murderer. So what I want to show you in this sugya, and with this we're going to end, or drop over time, which is that we have different interpretations here about how to view what we saw. Number one, we saw this af and different versions of, do you say with af, without af, and that one word made all the difference. Here it's very interesting there's two things that went on here. One is how you define murderers. So here we charted out intentional and unintentional, right? Intentional, intentional, unintentional, intentional, unintentional. So you had all different options, but it didn't all always line up, right? With, the truth is here, it does line up actually for the most part with punishment versus protection. Okay, in other words, what motivated one to say what they said? In other words, how they explained Abaye's approach and why a lot of murderers would mean we need more refuge cities was not only affected by how they viewed murderers, but how they defined murderers was often affected by what they viewed again, everybody I think agrees that the refuge city was both for punishment and for protection, but it's a matter of where you put the emphasis. What's more critical here? Is it more critical that these people need protection, or is it more critical that they need to be punished for what they did? And that's going to affect how you translate. So again, we don't have enough time to review everything, but that's what these answer guides are for, to go through and review. What I do want to do is I want to spend one more minute just going over a bunch of methodological things about what we did today. As I said before, the one question I knew at the beginning, I was going to leave this open, which is, can we take what Tosfot, Meiri, Ramban, Rabbeinu Yonatan, and Maharal said and apply it to the Shechem Sugya as well? Does it fit in with Shechem? Like if this was forest land, do we think that was also forest land? Probably not. So, then how do we explain that? Because if you remember, why did those 2.5 tribes want to live there? Because it was good land for grazing. So it probably did have a lot of trees, where Shechem was not a city, for example, with a lot of trees. So it's nice that you give this interpretation here. It doesn't necessarily hold water for the other sugya that we saw, where Shechem was also had a lot of murderers. Okay, so number one, we saw different versions, right? Different versions, both of the word af, with the word, without the word, different versions of how to understand rotzchim and how people interpreted things based on what their perspective is, right? You have to always ask the questions first, because if you ask the questions first, then you understand what's motivating the commentaries to say what they said. We learned about how a Braita starts and ends. We learned about how dichtiv is a key word to know that a verse is coming up, and shene'emar in the Mishnah is also telling you there's a verse coming up. How to identify questions and answers. We talked about how sometimes in the Gemara, you'll have an answer that doesn't exactly fit the question, like Abaye's answer didn't really fit, and then you go off on trying to see what the commentaries in each one kind of reads it in a bit of a different way. And then we just pointed out how these two sugiyot had the exact same structure. There was a question asked, each was a different question, but the answer was the exact same format and even the same content, which is, again, the content was somewhat different, but it had these ideas of Abaye said the answer, he then brought a verse, and then we have Rabbi Elazar explain the verse, and that was exactly the same in both of the sugiyot. So that often happens where you have these sugiyot that work together. So this was class 2, where we got to talk about not just what determines whether you go to Ir Miklat or not, but what actually happens on the way to Ir Miklat. And we got into seeing the whole chase and what was going on, and what happened and what role everybody plays in that. And then why we need more cities or the same amount of cities when we actually have a much smaller population, or why the people at the periphery, right, have a much longer way to go than the people in the center. For those who live in the center of the country, it doesn't bode well for us. But you see there that, and how they answered it. And then again, trying to figure out what exactly is the connection between accidental murder and intentional murder, which is a very obviously interesting question that pervades this whole sugya. How close is it to murder? How is it not really close to murder? And that really depends on your interpretation and how you view this. So more food for thought for this week, and we'll stop here and then we'll open to questions.